We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator.
Welcome to The Pursuit, a podcast where we examine and explore life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness 250 years after the Declaration of Independence and the founders declared those rights as unalienable and inherent in all people. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Pursuit at 250 podcast. I'm your host, Chad McKenna. We're doing something a little different for this episode. From time to time, I'll be posting episodes without any guests, but instead I'll dive into specific issues that are affecting our communities, maybe something we've touched on in a previous episode, but we didn't get a chance to fully dive into, or things that I just find interesting about our history or the world around us. There will be a new episode up in the next few days with an interview that I think you'll find interesting. Keep your eyes out for that coming up in the next couple of days. Today, I'm going to talk about something all three of our guests so far have talked about in their own way, public education. In our first episode, Delia talked about her experience as a public school teacher, the challenges of literacy in our culture, and the importance that reading plays in opening doors of opportunity and power. In our second episode, Sarah and I talked about the lasting impact that the education we received in Prior Lake schools had on us. And Lisa talked about, in our third episode, the formative experiences she and many other kids had in an after-school program she attended and how it taught concrete life skills and prepared kids for success. Just a note that if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, that you might want to switch over to either Spotify or YouTube, as I'll be having some visual aids as a part of the show today. I'll be putting some graphs and charts up on the screen. You can certainly continue to listen, and I'll put a link to what I'm showing on the screen in the show notes. So we're going to look at public education today through the lens of segregation in Duluth Public Schools. Not in years past, not in days gone by, but today in 2025. This issue is at the top of many parents' minds right now, as the Duluth schools recently made a decision to make changes to the Nuevo Visión Spanish immersion program in Duluth. This issue is of particular interest to me because my daughter is a student in that program and is among the kids that will be impacted by the change that we'll be discussing. So let's dig into it. After attending the Lowell Elementary PTA meeting last week, and then an information session hosted by the school district this week, I have lots of thoughts about the Duluth Public Schools' decision to move half of the kids enrolled in the Spanish immersion program at Lowell Elementary to Myers-Wilkins Elementary this fall. Some background for those not following the issue: kids that live in the neighborhoods of Myers-Wilkins, Stowe, Laura MacArthur, Congdon, and Lester Park will be moving to Myers-Wilkins to expand the Spanish immersion program at that school. Kids from the neighborhoods of Lowell, Piedmont, Homecroft, and Lakewood will continue to attend Lowell in the Spanish immersion program. The reasons that the district have given for this change are, there's a couple of reasons that they've given. One, Lowell is bursting at the seams. It's housing 650 kids, and it's built for only 500 kids. The second reason is that there's lots of new housing being built in the Lowell neighborhood, and that requires that space be created for kids living in that area to go to their neighborhood school. Another reason is that the Spanish immersion program is continuing to grow, and it was always the plan to expand it to a new school at some point, which is not something that many of us parents knew, but we're finding out now. And then the last reason is that Duluth schools are becoming increasingly segregated. The Spanish immersion program is overwhelmingly white, and moving a band of kids from that program to Myers-Wilkins begins the process of desegregating Duluth Public Schools. Now, I've always known that racial segregation and economic disparity is pervasive in our city and its schools, but until I became a parent, my privilege really distanced me from understanding the depth of the dividing lines within our community. This change in where kids will be going to school sent me down a rabbit hole of data to try and understand that depth and think about how we can rise out of it. Writing and recording these episodes really helps me process and learn. I needed to put these thoughts down on proverbial paper, and I thought I'd invite you along for the journey. I walked away from the information session that the school district had on January 13th kind of frustrated. I was frustrated with the presentation. I was frustrated with some of my fellow parents. I was frustrated with myself and frustrated that we can't, as adults living in a prosperous democracy, fully fund schools, which is one of the root causes here. And we can't seem to do the hard things to solve problems in our public schools. The district presentation started out vague and it felt sort of perfunctory. They seemed to be hedging and nibbling around the edges, not getting to the tough questions and fundamental issues. But I took a moment and stepped back and thought about a couple of things and listening to them give the presentation. The first thing is I've facilitated many meetings in my life, some that had audiences as potentially unsatisfied as the group of parents assembled in the Lowell cafeteria. And whether it's rational or not, whether it's a conscious thought or not, as a facilitator, as someone sitting at the front of the room, you're waiting for the pitchforks to come out. You're worried about saying the wrong thing. You're sort of reconciling your thoughts and feelings with your role and responsibility in the situation in that meeting. And you're wondering if you're doing the right thing, if you're saying the right thing. Plus, there was a news camera pointed at the group of facilitators and those speaking at the front of the room the whole time, which adds a completely different dynamic to the situation. And the second thing I thought about is that this decision has been made. It doesn't seem like it's up for debate or for open to changing. So I was thinking about how do I communicate my frustrations with the process while also focusing on how to help kids move forward and make this change a positive. I often find myself self-conscious at school events like this. I'm often the only or one of only a few men in the room, though this was not the case during this meeting last week, which was great. And the parents at Lowell are smart, thoughtful, and dedicated. And so I usually keep quiet. I just show up and volunteer to do whatever needs to be done and try and do my part. That said, I sometimes end up regretting that I did not say what I was thinking at the time, and the meeting on Monday was definitely an example of that. A fellow parent and Duluth teacher, Erica Drengler, spoke up early on and did a great job relaying appreciation for the district leaders that work hard every day for our kids, while also making an important point, and I'm paraphrasing here, that we have tough conversations that we have to have about school boundaries, and we can't shy away from those. After reading what parents had posted on social media and talking with several friends and talking with parents at an impromptu play date at Myers-Wilkins after the change was announced, Erica's comments seemed like they were just the tip of the iceberg and it needed to be addressed. But the thought that often creeps up to me in these situations surfaced: in a room full of smart, dedicated moms, am I the one who needs to be asking this important question when everyone knows it needs to be said? Let's back up a bit. Here's my general opinion on this decision to split up the Spanish immersion program by where kids live. I'm fine with it. It makes sense. I wish the communication would have been better. I wish we would have been told, this is the plan eventually, and heads up, we're getting close to the point where we have to make change. But we weren't told those things. And I'll be honest, and maybe I'm a bad parent or community member for saying this, but I had no idea that Lowell was housing 650 kids when it's only built for 500. I had no idea that the continued influx of predominantly white kids into the Spanish immersion program was exacerbating a diversity challenge for the district. And I didn't fully comprehend the dramatic differences in socioeconomic and racial makeup of our schools. I knew it existed, but I didn't really understand the full extent of it. I send my kid to school. I check her homework. I make sure she's reading at home. I read the emails from her teacher and make sure she's been progressing in her education. For 2 years, I was on the PTA, and we tried as a family to attend every school event. But I never realized these things about our school. This information was probably shared with me, and so I'm guilty of missing it. It took this abrupt change to sort of get my attention in this case. But now that I know these things and the district leadership is saying, this is the plan, this is what we need to do, I'm on board. I tend to trust the professionals, whether it's my nurse practitioner telling me to exercise more and eat less processed food, or my mechanic telling me what's wrong with my car, or the people who spend every day worrying about our kids telling me what we need to do to make the district function. So when they say, this is what we need, this is what needs to happen, my default response is to trust them. So anyway, back to the iceberg that Erica tipped us off to. Several parents have stated pretty plainly what their concerns are with this change, but I didn't really hear the concerns explicitly relayed except for in Erica's comment during the meeting with the district. But here are those concerns. So the district has an equity and diversity problem that we'll walk through here in a minute, and that needs to be addressed. But it can only really be solved in a systemic way by redrawing boundaries and changing where some kids go to school. And instead of having those tough conversations, the Spanish immersion program is being used as a Band-Aid to improve diversity numbers for 2 schools without addressing the underlying problems. Some parents feel like we're being used as pawns, which doesn't feel great or forthright. Now, all that said, I don't actually feel that I'm being used as a pawn, but I understand why other people feel that way. For me, the district is asking us to be part of a solution, and we could embrace that request and set an example for future conversations. When parents complain that they are being forced to send their kids to a different school, we can stand up and say, we were too. And you know what? It's fine. It's great. Myers-Wilkins is a great school with great staff and great kids. This change is the right thing to do. It's what we do as a community. We do what's hard because it is necessary and equitable. And those conversations are going to happen whether people like it or not. And we'll go through why here in a minute. Now, none of this is new, and disparity in Duluth is older than the city itself. Some of these tough conversations began but never gained traction or materialized in any changes back in 2018. Some of Duluth schools had a significantly disproportionate number of white students enrolled compared to the district demographics as a whole, while other schools had disproportionate number of students of color enrolled compared to the district demographic as a whole. Some schools had much higher rates of kids qualifying for free or reduced lunch compared to other schools. I didn't have kids in the district back in 2018, and I only peripherally tracked these issues in the news, but some parents that I know were involved in these conversations, and some of them used different words to describe these quote unquote tough conversations. They used words like mean, tribal, and racist. One parent told me their teenager walked away from a meeting about redrawing district lines and asked, "Is that really how adults talk to each other?" And she replied, "Yeah, unfortunately it is." Those numbers that we were talking about in 2018 persist and have even intensified today. So at the PTA meeting that was held last week after this news was announced, a parent spoke up to ask a question of the superintendent, who, to his credit, attended the meeting. Didn't have to do that, but attended the meeting and tried to field questions ahead of the meeting that they had already scheduled on January 13th. And the parent started with, "I'm not racist, but," and then proceeded to disprove that statement with stereotypes and tropes. The concern she had was about behavioral issues with kids in the new elementary school, as if that's something unique to any one school. Some kids have trouble following direction, news at 11, right? She was, though, connecting race, economic opportunity, and behavioral issues into a sort of cause and effect relationship. These kids are X, therefore they do Y. And this is where I want to pause my commentary on this situation and dive into some numbers that really open my eyes to the type of disparity that we have in public schools. So let's first talk about socioeconomic indicators in our schools and how that relates or doesn't relate to race. One big indicator that school districts and the state use for quantifying the economic situation of families is looking at how many kids qualify for free or reduced lunch. This graph on the screen breaks down by school the percentage of students who qualify for free or reduced lunch. As you'll see, Myers-Wilkins Elementary has the highest percentage of kids that are eligible for free or reduced lunch, 90%. Just to be clear, this means that if you pick 10 kids out of a class, 9 of them have a household income that qualifies them for free or reduced lunch. And you can see that it varies greatly throughout the district, what percentage of the student body at each individual school qualify for free or reduced lunch. The Myers-Wilkins number of 90% differs greatly from Congdon, which is the lowest percent, at 18%. I've also included Hermantown and Proctor numbers in this data just as reference since they're area schools. So what does eligible for free or reduced lunch mean? A student is eligible for reduced lunch if their household's income is less than 1.85 times the federal poverty rate. Free lunch is available for students whose household income is less than 1.3 times the federal poverty rate. This chart on the screen now here outlines the federal poverty level for different family sizes and the corresponding free or reduced lunch income threshold. So, for example, a child in a household of 4 whose income is less than $55,000 qualifies for reduced lunch price, and a child in a household of 4 whose income is less than $39,000 qualifies for free lunch. If you're looking at this chart and wondering what I'm wondering, yes, we're correct. An only child whose single parent works full-time and makes $18 an hour makes too much money to qualify for either free or reduced lunch. Let me repeat that. An only child whose single parent works full-time and makes $18 an hour makes too much money to qualify for free or reduced lunch. Then there's the issue of racial segregation in our schools. The district, state, and federal government also track the racial demographics of schools. On the screen now here is how each school breaks down by race in terms of their student population. I've again included Hermantown and Proctor here just as reference since they're area schools. And then this is that data turned into a pretty graph with colors. Again, this is Duluth students by student population, by school, and by race. Now, given the fact that Duluth is largely a white city, has a large white population, looking at the demographics of each school in terms of white and non-white is worth a look because it paints a pretty stark picture. So now what is the relationship between race, eligibility for free or reduced lunch, and household income? Before we dig into that question, let me say a little bit about correlation and causation, something that is often confused by the "I'm not a racist but" crowd. The schools that have disproportionately high numbers of non-white students, i.e. Myers-Wilkins, Laura MacArthur, and Piedmont, also have a disproportionately high number of students that qualify for free or reduced lunch. This is what we call a correlation. Correlation doesn't mean causation. The data points may be related, but there's no evidence that one variable in and of itself causes the other. Up on the screen now demonstrates that relationship between race and free or reduced lunch at each school in the Duluth School District and the district as a whole. Again, I've included Hermantown and Proctor schools just as reference since they are area schools. So for example of that correlation versus causation point that I just made, for example, there's no evidence to support the statement that schools have more students qualifying for free or reduced lunch because they have more non-white students. However, there's clearly a connection between race and income. The data shows us that. So what's the nature of that connection? There's plenty of evidence that racial inequality manifests itself in economic terms in the form of lower hourly wages or gross annual income, and in diminished access to higher education, apprenticeships, and other economic prosperity springboards in our economy. Up on the screen now is a demonstration of the connection between race and economic prosperity. You can see that income, the median household income in Minnesota, varies dramatically depending on a person's race. But the connection is not limited to income. There are correlations between race and health outcomes and life expectancy, types of occupation and rates of entrepreneurship, labor market participation and unemployment rates, educational attainment, military service, and other socioeconomic data points. There's also plenty of evidence to support the statement that poverty causes challenges like health issues stemming from access or lack of access to nutrient-dense food, homelessness, sheer lack of food, or the inability to receive medical treatment for illnesses, and that those challenges saddle kids with stress that can lead to behavioral issues and that can greatly impact their ability to succeed in school. So when we hear people using racial demographics and income levels essentially interchangeably, I think this is why. It's a sort of careless extrapolation of correlation that is pretty dangerous if we don't identify the underlying inequity and racism still prevalent in our economy. There is a correlation between race, income, and eligibility for free or reduced lunch, but it's because of our economic, health, and civic, and yes, school systems that they have racism baked into them still to this day. This is nothing new to our state, our country, or our city. This correlation exists. We should always recognize it, and we should work to change it. But this correlation is complicated and unfortunately gets oversimplified in racist terms with "I'm not a racist, but" type observations. So what now? We may not like the plan that the district has made, and it may not be perfect, but moving a band of kids from Lowell to Myers-Wilkins based on where they live may be the only viable option. Now, will some families choose not to make the move and not send their kid to the Spanish immersion program? Of course. But that would be the case no matter what the decision was. Does the district have much deeper issues of equity and segregation? Yes. Do they have major issues in terms of budget deficit that they have to be addressed in many different ways? Yes. But Duluth has segregated schools along socioeconomic and racial lines. Segregated schools aren't just bad for this group of kids or that group of kids. It's bad for everyone. This change with the Spanish immersion program isn't a panacea, but it's a step in the direction of recognizing segregation and inequity and trying to rectify it. Schools that more closely reflect the community are better for everyone, and we shouldn't shy away from that being a goal, not simply because economic and racial diversity are silver bullets or will magically fix every problem, but because if we allow historic economic and sociological forces to perpetuate segregation in our schools, then the disparity will be perpetuated in our economy and in our housing and our health outcomes. A system where life expectancy for the average person living in the Woodland neighborhood is 90 years old and 69 years old for a person living in Lincoln Park. It's a 21-year difference between neighborhoods that are 10 minutes apart. That is not a system that is ensuring life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everyone. We also shouldn't pretend that we can attain diversity without doing things that we hadn't planned on doing or without addressing problems that many of us have had the privilege of ignoring. I said up at the top of the episode that I was frustrated that adults can't seem to do the hard work of solving these problems. But maybe, just maybe, that's what we're starting to do. So I hope fellow parents will encourage me and join me to keep leaning in and exploring solutions to these problems that are affecting our kids and our community, and that we'll work in partnership with the school board and with the district to solve these problems. And then we'll have a real honest conversation about how we are funding schools and how we're making policy about schools at a state and federal level. In my opinion, we're really screwing that up. And the kids are bearing the brunt of that. Our public education system is key to ensuring that everybody has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thanks for listening. The Pursuit at 250 podcast is a production of Cool Cousin Studios. It is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Chad McKenna. The views and statements expressed on The Pursuit are those of the guests and host and do not represent the views of any other person or organization. The theme music is Circles by the Twin Ports band The Resonance. Check out their music in the show notes.
That's my dad.